Hello everyone, my name is Keith Lima. Welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing the history of food in 3 parts. But before we start today's episode, I wanted to start out by telling you a quick little story. A couple of months back, a very close family member of mine got sick. She had a fever, she had a cough, she had shortness of breath. She wasn't doing so hot, but she was at home. I texted her and said, "I'd like to come over and visit you." She said, "Well, I don't want you to come over, or I don't want you to get sick." So I said, I'm going to be inside your apartment in 15 minutes. Before I left my house, I grabbed 3 things. I grabbed a pulse oximeter, I grabbed a pen, and I grabbed a piece of paper. Now, for those of you who don't know, a pulse oximeter is a device that measures the oxygen saturation in your blood. I grabbed those 3 items, I went over to her house, and I said, "Here's what I want you to do." On the piece of paper with a pen, I wrote down a few rules. Rule number 1, I want you to check your oxygen saturation several times a day over the course of the next couple of days. If at any point your oxygen saturation drops below 90%, I want you to go to the hospital. But in the meantime, if you're in the 90s, I want you to follow the following rules. Rule number 1, I want you to eat at most twice a day. Once a day if you can, but at most twice a day. Rule number 2, no snacking whatsoever in between. And rule number 3, no carbohydrates. Now, if you want to eat as much as you can, if you want to stuff your face during those 1 or 2 meals that you have, that's fine. But no snacking in between and no carbohydrates whatsoever. 4 days later, she was feeling 100%. As if she had never been sick at all. The interesting part of the story is about a month later, I met up with her and her husband at a restaurant for dinner. She leaned over and said, "Keith, I got my period." And I said, "Well, okay, that's great." And she said, No, Keith, I haven't had my period in 3 years." How can it be that a person gets better that quickly? And how can it be that a person who hadn't had her period in 3 years got it in just about a month of tweaking her diet? Well, it all starts with something called homeostasis. Homeostasis is any self-regulating process by which biological systems tend to maintain stability while adjusting to conditions that are optimal for survival. Okay, what does this mean? It means that all biological systems evolved to survive in a certain range. Okay, now what does that mean? If you're human, you need a certain temperature range in which to survive. Some bacteria, for example, can live at the bottom of geysers at temperatures above 200 degrees. Humans need a solid temperature range to survive. If it's too cold, obviously we die. If it's below 32 degrees, we need something to keep us warm. If it's too hot, we start sweating, and that helps us cool off. This is the process of homeostasis. All biological systems evolve in a certain environment, and they evolved to maintain homeostasis within a certain range. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, in discussing the history of food, it's important to note where we evolved, where we came from, and what our environment looked like way back at the beginning. Now, there's a very old article here called Diet and Primate Evolution, which was printed in Scientific American and written by Catherine Milton. It was printed in 2006, kind of an old article at this point, but very interesting. And basically, she outlines human evolution and our diet all the way back to beginning, and she starts the clock at about 55 million years ago. Why 55 million years, not more, not less? According to Catherine, our ancestors first crawled into trees approximately 55 million years ago. And in an effort to maintain homeostasis, we evolved certain features. What were those features? Well, if you're talking about something like a lion has claws, a lion has sharp teeth to allow a lion to survive in its own environment. Lions are carnivores. It needs claws. It needs teeth. But what about humans? So if you look at our earliest ancestors that first crawled into trees 55 million years ago, we evolved hands and fingers. Why is this? Why do we need these knobby things? Why not claws? Why not teeth? Why did we evolve fingers? Well, it wasn't just fingers and hands. We also evolved depth perception and color vision. Not all animals can see in color. Why did we evolve these things? Why did we evolve these features? Well, ostensibly, it's so that we could pick fruit and forage. For a long time, even to today, humans and our ancestors foraged for food. So for 55 million years, actually subtract that, for 53 million years, this is what life was like for our ancestors. They foraged, they used their hands and fingers, they used depth perception and color vision to look for what? Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Possibly the occasional bug. But if we fast forward 55 million years ago, so now it's 2 million years ago, things started to change. According to Catherine, around 2 million years ago to 2.6 million years ago, we started seeing shrinking tropical forests, periods of glaciation, and a decrease in the diversity of tree species. This is not good for a species or a line of species that evolved in the trees. Not good at all. So how does a species like this survive in an environment where things are going wrong? So we evolved in tropical forests, but now they're shrinking. You have decrease in decrease in the diversity of tree species. How do we get through that? Well, for one thing, we started evolving an increase in brain size. We encountered problems and we needed a larger brain to help us through it. And we also started searching for quality food. If most of our food was coming from the trees that we were living in or around in a tropical area, where do we get food? So we evolved migration and we started to scavenge. So 2 million years ago, from 55 million years ago up to 2 million years ago, our diet consisted of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, for the most part. And then around 2 million to 2.6 million years ago, now we started to scavenge for meat that was left over. We weren't hunting yet. We were scavenging for meat. So it's important to know that all of this time, it was fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, and only up until 2 million years ago did we start eating meat. And even then, we weren't hunting, it was scavenging. So you fast forward the clock, 790,000 years ago, we have the first evidence of fire. Fast forward again to 500,000 years ago, and we have the first evidence of hunting technology in the form of spear points. And 71,000 years ago, even closer, we have first evidence of projectile weapons. And then finally, 10,000 years ago is the advent of agriculture. 10,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, somewhere in that ballpark. So I want you to notice something. For the bulk of actually I can move down here. For the bulk of our history, our diet for 96.4% of this time, our diet consisted of raw vegan, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. For the past 3.6% of this time, we've been eating meat. And only for the past 1.4% of this time have we been eating cooked food. So that's a significant amount of time. It's 53 million years where we were eating raw vegan. And only the past 3.6% of the time have we been eating meat? Now, if you look at this chart, you'll notice something. We evolved in this area where we're eating fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, and then things started to change, but things started to change at a faster and faster pace. Now, that brings us to part 2, where we discuss the agricultural revolution and all of the changes that have taken place in our diet since then. Part number 2 in just a second. All right, folks, this brings us to part number 2. If part number 2 looks a lot more complicated and a lot more busy than the other chart, that's because things are speeding up. Things are going faster and faster the closer and closer we get to the present. So let's start with the very beginning of the agricultural revolution. The first evidence that we have of domesticating animals comes to approximately 13,000 years ago, where pigs were domesticated in Mesopotamia. At about 11,500 years ago, we started domesticating wheat, barley, peas, lentils, garbanzo beans, flax, and bitter vetch. Why is this important? Well, wheat, rice, and maize are considered the plants of civilization. That means carbohydrates are now available year-round. 55 million years ago, we were eating carbohydrates in the summertime, and we were not eating carbohydrates in the wintertime. Or if we were, it was coming in the form of leaves. So what does that mean? Now, green leafy vegetables are now abandoned as a winter alternative to carbohydrates. So around 11,500 years ago, we start eating wheat, barley, peas, lentils, garbanzo beans, etc., and we started storing it over the winter. Prior to that, we did not have access to that kind of carbohydrates in the winter, and we were forced to eat green leafy vegetables. But now, after 55 million years of evolution, for the first time, we abandoned that. So you fast forward to 10,000 years ago, potatoes were domesticated in South America, cacao was domesticated, and bananas in New Guinea were domesticated. 9,000 years ago, we have sugar cane that was domesticated. Around 8,200 years ago, rice was domesticated in China. That's, again, one of the plants of civilization. And then around 8,000 years ago, something really interesting happens. Notice the pace is picking up. Around 8,000 years ago, we have the first evidence of salt production. Why is that important? That's important because salt is the very first processed food. You fast forward to about 8,000 years ago, I'm sorry, about the same. You've got maize, which was domesticated in Mesoamerica. I know it's kind of a mistake there, sorry. But you have maize, which was domesticated in Mesoamerica. So now you have all three of what we call the plants of civilization between 11,500 years ago and 8,000 years ago. Okay. Let's fast forward the clock even more. 1,673 years ago, we crystallized sugar. And again, I want you to notice that if we backtrack 55 million years, we had this long track where it was fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. We evolved homeostatic mechanisms to allow us to live with fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. And then 2 million years ago, there was a change. And then 12,000 years ago, approximately, there was another change. And then we get to 1,673 years ago, and now we're eating crystallized sugar. We're moving further and further and further away from what we originally evolved to consume. 214 years ago, approximately the year 1809, the first canned foods were invented. 102 years ago, the first fast food restaurant was developed. I believe that was White Castle. I could be wrong. 69 years ago, TV dinners were developed, loaded with salt. 68 years ago, 1955, President Eisenhower became the first president to have a heart attack. The first sitting president that we know of to have a heart attack. Why would that be? Why did we go through so many presidents that we know of that didn't have a heart attack? And in 1955, Eisenhower became the first sitting president to have what we call an MI, or myocardial infarction. And then, year zero years ago, 2023, the FDA approves lab-grown meat. So we're not hunting the meat anymore. We're not raising the meat in farms anymore. Well, we are, but now the FDA has approved lab-grown meat. So now we're going to start eating meat that's grown in a lab instead of grown on a farm or ranch. So you notice, again, and I keep hammering away at this, you notice that initially we evolved in a certain environment where we ate fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, and then that changed. And then something else changed faster and faster and faster. And we get to the point now where we're living in a modern environment where our food doesn't resemble anything of what it looked like 55 million years ago. So what does that mean? Well, that brings me to part number 3 in this video. All right, this is part 3. What we have here is a chart of our food source and the percentage of our evolutionary history that we have spent adapting to each of these food sources. So if we rewind the clock back 55 million years, we've spent 96.4% of our time adapting to a raw vegan diet. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds that we were picking with tools that we evolved to adapt to our environment. We moved to 2 million years ago, to 2.6 million years ago. We started eating meat that we were scavenging. We weren't hunting yet, but we were scavenging meat that had been hunted by others. 3.6% of our evolutionary history, we've spent, let me back up here, we've spent 3.6% of our evolutionary history adapting to meat as a food source. We discovered fire, first evidence of fire, about 790,000 years ago. So even if we rewind the clock all the way back to that point, we've spent the past 1.4% of our evolutionary history adapting to cooked food. Now, as we move the clock forward a little bit further, stored carbohydrates, we've spent 0.02% of our evolutionary history adapting to stored carbohydrates. And by stored carbohydrates, I mean rice, wheat, barley, different agricultural products that we could store over the course of the winter. But that could also mean, well, processed sugar. We've spent 0.003% of our time adapting to processed sugar. Processed salt, 0.015%. So the further and further we go in time, the less time our physiology has spent adapting to those food sources. Canned food, 0.0003% of our evolutionary history has been spent adapting to that food source. So if you crack open even a can of beans, anything canned, your physiology has only spent the past 0.003% of its time adapting to that food source. Fast food, 0.0001% of our evolutionary history has been spent towards adapting to fast food. And finally, lab-grown meat. Well, what are you going to do? So when you look at this chart, you have to ask yourself, I mean, obviously this is a raw vegan channel, but when you look at this chart, you have to ask yourself, which would you rather choose? Your physiology has spent 55 million years adapting and expecting certain food sources. Yes, it is true that for the past 2 million to 2.6 million years, we have been eating meat. Yes, it is true. And for the past 1.4% of our time, we've been eating cooked food. Absolutely. But when you look at this chart, it becomes abundantly clear that our physiology is best adapted to consume raw fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. But the choice is up to you. I'll see you in the next episode.